Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at an era where urban geography, public panic, and the absolute infancy of police science just completely collided.
They collided in the most spectacular and devastating way imaginable.
Exactly. We are heading straight into the damp, fog-choked streets of London, specifically the year 1888. We're going to examine the shadow that completely paralyzed the Whitechapel district.
It is an absolute privilege to delve into this with you.
Yeah, we have a lot to cover. We're going to unpack the setting, the timeline of the public panic, the desperate police investigation, the notorious letters sent to the press, and the endless, maddening pursuit of an unknown phantom.
And I think we need to establish right out of the gate that this is not just a standard chronicle of historical crimes.
Right.
Because if we view it merely as a sequence of tragic events, we miss the entire point of why this story has survived for over a century. This is fundamentally a case study in sociology.
It really is.
Yeah. It's a masterclass in how an environment can act as an active accomplice, how the absolute limits of early forensic science can cripple a manhunt, and how contagious public panic can warp the reality of an entire city.
Yeah, it's the perfect storm that created an immortal legend.
Precisely.
And here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. Despite a massive police investigation, despite the mobilization of hundreds of officers, and despite an entire metropolis being on high alert with the whole world watching through the daily papers.
The killer was never officially caught.
Never. They vanished. They just evaporated into the fog of history and became a ghost. So today, we're going to explore exactly why catching this person was nearly impossible in the late 1800s.
Which means we need to go straight into the mechanics of this mystery, starting with the physical stage itself.
Yeah, let's look at the duality of 1888 London. Because in the late 19th century, London is the undisputed capital of the world.
It's a booming metropolis.
The absolute epicenter of global commerce, full of towering buildings, grand avenues, relentless industrial progress. And it's a massive, but hidden right behind that facade of wealth is Whitechapel.
What's fascinating here is the sheer brutality of that sociological contrast.
Yeah.
When a metropolis grows that rapidly, propelled by the Industrial Revolution, it generates staggering wealth. But it also creates these dark, neglected pockets. They become essentially dumping grounds for the extreme poverty that the wealthy districts want to ignore.
It was almost a different country. Whitechapel was practically a world apart from the grand estates of the West End.
It was an area defined by absolute congestion. We are talking about tens of thousands of people crammed into a remarkably small geographic footprint, living in rookeries and lodging houses.
And the physical environment absolutely reflects that neglect. Whitechapel wasn't just poor, it was architecturally oppressive.
That's a great way to put it.
It was a labyrinth. You have these incredibly narrow, winding alleyways that cut back on themselves.
Dead ends everywhere.
Right. Unlit courtyards and passages barely wide enough for two people to pass shoulder to shoulder. Imagine you're trying to navigate a maze-like neighborhood like that.
And you have to add the infamous London fog to that mental image.
Oh, the pea souper.
Exactly. The smog created by millions of coal fires mixing with the damp river air.
This wasn't a light mist.
No, this was a thick, choking smog that physically obscured vision. Sometimes it cut visibility down to a few feet.
I always like to compare it to a modern power outage in a really dense city, that feeling of claustrophobia and vulnerability. Because even the lights they did have were terrible.
We really have to talk about the physics of the lighting. We often hear about the dim gas lamps of the Victorian era, but we need to understand what that actually means for human vision.
It's not like the streetlights we have today.
Not at all. Gaslight doesn't provide ambient, overlapping illumination the way modern electric streetlights do. A gas lamp creates a small, weak halo of yellow light, and immediately beyond that halo is absolute pitch blackness.
And that contrast messes with your eyes, doesn't it?
Immensely. In fact, those isolated pools of light can actually make the surrounding darkness seem even more impenetrable because your eyes are constantly struggling to adjust.
Plus the light is moving?
Yes. Gaslight casts long, deceptive shadows that flicker and move. It distorts your depth perception entirely.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second because I want to challenge that slightly.
Go ahead.
You have this labyrinth of narrow alleys, terrible lighting, and thick fog. I get that.
Yeah.
But Whitechapel was incredibly dense. As you said, a massive population crammed into tight quarters. With that kind of hyperdensity, you'd think the sheer number of eyes and ears would be a deterrent.
You would assume so.
Right. How does a killer operate with thousands of people practically stacked on top of each other in these lodging houses and tenements?
Yeah.
Why didn't someone see something and stop it?
That is a brilliant point, and it touches on the paradox of extreme urban density.
How so?
When everyone is packed together in a state of grinding poverty, anonymity actually increases. In a neighborhood where violence, loud arguments, and drunken brawls are daily occurrences, people develop a survival mechanism.
They mind their own business.
Precisely. The acoustic environment of a dense slum actually masks the sounds of a struggle. If you hear a cry in the dark in Whitechapel in 1888, your first instinct isn't to run out and investigate.
Your instinct is to lock your door.
Yes, you lock your door and ignore it because getting involved usually meant trouble. Furthermore, the transient nature of the population in those lodging houses meant you rarely knew your neighbors.
So you have a dense population, yes, but it is a highly fragmented, socially disconnected population.
Completely disconnected.
So the environment itself was fundamentally inhospitable, breeding a natural apprehension. People naturally hurried home after sunset. They didn't linger.
And when you introduce a predator into that specific ecosystem, the advantages are entirely on the side of the person who wishes to remain unseen.
The darkness, the fog, the architecture, it wasn't just atmospheric dread. It was a tactical advantage.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, an environment that naturally forces people to hurry home in fear, an environment that inherently limits visibility and creates physical bottlenecks and escape routes that only a local would know.
It's the absolute perfect hunting ground.
The geography of Whitechapel was practically complicit in the crimes.
Which perfectly transitions us into the anatomy of the panic. How this went from a local tragedy to a citywide epidemic of fear.
The shift was incredibly rapid.
It really was. It started with a shocking discovery in the early morning hours, the first victim. And initially, the police assumed it was an isolated crime.
Which is standard law enforcement protocol, particularly in a rough neighborhood. An isolated incident, however brutal, does not threaten the overarching social order.
Right, it's terrible, but it's contained.
Exactly. It allows the community to wake up the next day, rationalize the event as a specific conflict between specific individuals, and just go about their business.
But then, weeks later, another victim is discovered, and then another. And a terrifying pattern locks into place.
Late at night, in the quietest, darkest streets.
And the killer always vanishes before the police arrive. This completely shatters the psychological contract of the community. Imagine the creeping dread of realizing that the random violence you thought you were dealing with isn't random at all.
It's calculated.
Yes. The societal reaction to that realization was profound. It fundamentally altered human behavior in the district.
Residents began locking their doors earlier, which in itself is a massive shift in a community where doors were often left open due to the sheer heat and overcrowding of the tenements.
People avoided walking alone.
And perhaps most tellingly from a sociological standpoint, businesses began to close prematurely.
Let's pause and really look at the brutal calculus of 1888 poverty here. We're talking about Whitechapel merchants, pub owners, and street vendors. Closing early for them isn't just a matter of losing a little extra pocket money.
Not at all. The margins of survival in that district were measured in pennies.
Literally pennies.
For a business owner to voluntarily pack up their goods, lock their doors, and turn away potential paying customers while there's still foot traffic, that is a massive behavioral anomaly.
It tells you that the immediate visceral fear of a grisly death finally outweighed the daily grinding fear of starvation.
The local economy was paralyzed. The killer was effectively holding an entire community hostage without ever showing their face.
Because the danger was completely invisible. People were describing the killer as a shadow moving through the fog. And the psychological toll of a formless threat is devastating.
When the threat could be anyone, the man walking quickly past you in the alley, the figure standing just outside the halo of the gas lamp, the paranoia becomes unbearable.
The fact that this shadow always seemed to evaporate just moments before the beat cops arrived gave the whole situation an almost supernatural terror.
And just as that terror reaches a boiling point, the narrative takes a sharp, unprecedented turn.
The shadow decides to speak.
We move into the birth of a legend, fueled entirely by the introduction of the media into the investigation. Newspapers and police departments began receiving strange letters from a writer claiming to be the killer.
And one of those letters is signed with a nickname that would instantly become infamous, cementing itself in criminal history. Jack the Ripper.
The moment that name hits the print newspapers, the entire dynamic of the panic changes.
The nickname spread like wildfire across the city.
What's fascinating here is the power of a brand name. Think about what happens when you give a nameless, formless dread a catchy, terrifying moniker.
It packages the horror into a narrative.
It elevates the crimes from a series of local, grim tragedies into a mythological, almost theatrical event. A brand name can be printed in bold, towering headlines. It can be shouted by paper boys on every street corner in London.
It's the 1888 equivalent of modern internet virality.
It really is.
Today, a catchy nickname or a trending hashtag goes viral, and within hours, it's inescapable. In the late 19th century, the print newspapers were the internet. They were the mass communication network.
When that name was printed, you couldn't walk down a street, step into a pub, or buy a loaf of bread without hearing it.
It made the fear inescapable.
And this creates a highly toxic, symbiotic relationship between the press, the police, and the public. The penny press, these cheap daily newspapers, relied entirely on sensationalism to drive circulation.
They needed a compelling, terrifying story to sell papers.
The public, meanwhile, is terrified, but they're also morbidly obsessed with the gritty details.
Human nature hasn't changed much in that regard.
Exactly. And the police are caught squarely in the middle, trying to manage a panicked populace while conducting a manhunt under the glare of intense media scrutiny.
But this introduces a major point of friction within the investigation itself. The investigators were heavily divided on these letters. Some believed they were genuinely written by the killer, taunting them. But many others believed they were complete hoaxes, fake letters sent by everyday people.
Which was a very valid suspicion.
Now, I have to say, I struggle with that a bit. Why would everyday people living in or near this terrified community, deliberately write fake letters to amplify the terror? You are essentially throwing gasoline on a fire that could burn your own neighborhood down.
It raises a deeply uncomfortable question about human nature. Why do people insert themselves into tragedies?
Right. Why do it?
Partially, it's the sheer morbid novelty of it. Some people want to feel close to power, even if that power is a terrifying criminal.
That's about ego.
Yes. By writing a hoax letter that gets published in the national press and sends the police running in circles, an otherwise powerless, marginalized person suddenly has the attention of the entire British Empire.
Wow. That makes a terrifying kind of sense.
Furthermore, we have to consider that journalists themselves were highly suspected of writing some of the most famous letters.
Right. Because if the killer goes quiet, circulation drops. So a reporter pens a letter in red ink, signs it with a terrifying nickname, sends it to his own editor or to Scotland Yard, and suddenly he has the front page exclusive for the next week.
Exactly. The debate over the hoaxes highlights the dark side of society, how people, driven by profit or twisted ego, willingly contributed to the paralysis of their own city.
The panic wasn't just caused by the killer. It was manufactured and amplified by the public and the press.
The name stuck, the fear escalated, and the killer transitioned from a physical threat into an enduring character.
So the public is completely terrified. The media is fanning the flames with these viral letters. The police are being mocked in the papers. How on earth do the authorities even begin to respond to that kind of pressure?
With overwhelming force.
Which brings us to the incredible, almost insurmountable challenge of conducting a massive manhunt in the pre-forensic era.
The scale of the police response was unprecedented. They flooded the streets of Whitechapel. Detectives were conducting house-to-house searches, interviewing thousands of witnesses, dragging in endless streams of suspects for questioning.
They were throwing immense manpower at the problem.
But they were hitting a brick wall.
Because the year is 1888. Because we are decades away from basic forensics. The entire weight of this massive investigation fell entirely on human observation.
It's hard for us to grasp today just how limited they were.
We aren't just talking about a lack of modern databases or digital footprints. They had no blood typing. Systematic fingerprinting wasn't being used in criminal investigations yet.
Crime scene preservation was practically non-existent. Often, the bodies were moved or washed before a medical examiner could even properly document the scene.
Think about that for a second. If you strip away every scientific tool we rely on today to prove guilt, what are you left with?
You are left with physical proximity and eyewitness testimony. You have to catch the person literally holding the knife, or you have to rely on someone who saw them.
And we've already established how physically compromised the environment was. Let's really look at the unreliability of those witnesses. You are an investigator, and you are asking a local resident what they saw at 2 a.m.
In an alley filled with thick fog.
Illuminated by a flickering gas lamp that casts moving shadows.
Add to that the fact that the witness has probably just stumbled out of a pub or they are exhausted from a 14-hour shift at the docks.
And they are operating under extreme psychological stress because they know a killer is on the loose.
The human brain is notoriously terrible at recalling exact physical details under high stress in broad daylight. In the conditions of Whitechapel, eyewitness testimony is inherently physically compromised.
And the police tactics of the day were incredibly rigid. The beat cops walked a highly specific timed route.
A beat system.
Yes, they had a physical beat they had to march, and they had to hit specific checkpoints at exact minutes.
Which is a massive tactical vulnerability. If you have a killer who knows the neighborhood, they can literally stand in the shadows, watch the policemen walk past, and know with absolute certainty that they have exactly 12 or 15 minutes before that officer loops back around.
The police were operating like clockwork in an environment where the killer was operating completely fluidly.
It gave the killer an incredible advantage.
The frustration for those detectives must have been agonizing. They were questioning suspects daily. The killer could have literally been sitting across the desk from an inspector, answering questions calmly, and the police would have absolutely no scientific way to hold them.
Without a confession, without a pristine eyewitness, you have nothing.
The crowded, confusing streets allowed the killer to slip away every single time. It was exactly like trying to catch a ghost.
And when science fails you, and physical evidence doesn't exist, and your witnesses are unreliable, investigations are forced to pivot.
Right, you have to change strategy.
You have to move from looking at what was left behind to analyzing who would be capable of doing this. You have to build a psychological framework.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this pivot is where we see the absolute genesis of criminal profiling. Because they lacked physical proof, the investigators and theorists had to rely on behavioral logic. They had to profile the unknown.
It was revolutionary for the time.
Over the years, countless suspect theories emerged, but they generally coalesced around three distinct profiles. Let's spend some time breaking down the logic behind each of these, starting with the first, the local resident.
The local resident profile is rooted entirely in the survival mechanics of the crimes. We discussed the labyrinthian nature of Whitechapel.
The narrow alleys, the dead ends.
If a wealthy aristocrat or an outsider from the West End came down into those alleys in the dead of night, they would be hopelessly lost within minutes. Furthermore, a well-dressed stranger would draw immediate attention in a neighborhood deeply suspicious of outsiders.
They'd stick out like a sore thumb.
Exactly. To commit these crimes in total darkness and then successfully evade a massive police dragnet time and time again requires an intimate, internalized map of the geography.
You have to know the layout blindfolded.
The killer had to know which courtyards had secondary exits, which fences could be vaulted, which alleyways led to blind drops. The local resident theory implies that the killer was so successful precisely because they were operating on their own home turf.
They could vanish because they merely had to step back into their own lodging house and blend in with the local population.
It's the most pragmatic theory.
That makes incredible tactical sense. But then we have the second prominent profile, someone with medical knowledge. This theory implies something much darker than just a local resident who knows his way around an alley.
This raises an important question about the nature of the violence. If investigators, including police surgeons at the time, were suggesting the killer had medical knowledge, it means these were not chaotic, frenzied attacks of blunt force.
There was a methodology to what was left behind.
It suggested a level of anatomical precision that a random street thief simply wouldn't possess.
But how much medical knowledge are we talking about here? Because that was a massive point of debate back then. Were they looking for a highly educated surgeon from a wealthy hospital? Or could this just be a local butcher or a slaughterhouse worker who simply knew how to handle a blade and take apart a carcass?
That was the exact friction point for the investigators. If it's a high society surgeon, you are looking for a wealthy outsider, which contradicts the local resident theory.
Yay.
If it's a slaughterhouse worker, it fits the local profile perfectly, as Whitechapel had numerous abattoirs. But regardless of the degree of education, the implication of medical precision adds a chilling layer of cold calculation to the crimes.
It wasn't just rage. It was methodical.
It was terrifyingly methodical.
Which brings us to the third profile, and honestly the one that I find the most unsettling. The theory that the killer was someone who appeared completely ordinary during the day.
This is a psychological legacy of the case, the concept of the mask of sanity.
Yes. The realization that monsters do not look like gargoyles hiding in the sewers. They don't look like cartoon villains.
They look like us.
Exactly. The most dangerous predator is the one who looks like the clerk at the bank, or the guy sitting next to you drinking a pint at the pub, or the person selling you your morning newspaper. It's the person who hides in plain sight, living a perfectly mundane life under the sun, who only drops the mask when the fog rolls in.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the terror of the ordinary citizen killer fundamentally shatters the social contract.
Because you don't know who to trust.
If the killer looks completely normal, then absolutely everyone is a suspect. You can't just cross the street to avoid the suspicious-looking character in the shadows. You have to suspect your neighbor, your landlord, your customers. It weaponizes paranoia.
So what does this all mean for you listening today? Think about the true crime landscape we consume now. Our entire modern understanding of serial predators is built on these exact behavioral pillars.
It's foundational.
When the FBI's behavioral science unit looks at a case, what do they look for? They look for the killer's comfort zone, the local resident theory. They look for specific signatures and methodologies, the medical knowledge theory. And they warn us about the organized offender who maintains a facade of normalcy, the ordinary citizen theory.
What we are seeing in the 1888 investigation is the desperate foundational groundwork of modern criminal profiling being drawn up by men who didn't even have the vocabulary for what they were hunting.
They were applying pure deductive logic to an impossible situation.
They were mapping the psychology of a serial killer decades before the term serial killer was even coined. But despite all that deductive reasoning, despite the massive dragnets and the profiling, the brutal historical reality remains.
The mystery never ended. More than a century later, the case remains officially, infuriatingly unsolved. The killer's identity was never proven in a court of law, but society has never let it go.
We simply can't.
Historians, criminologists, and amateur sleuths are still completely obsessed with it. They are constantly digging through the archives, examining the old evidence, rereading the surviving letters, scrutinizing the police records. New theories and suspects are still being proposed to this day.
We have to ask ourselves why. Why does a series of crimes from the 1880s still command such immense cultural real estate?
And why do you think that is?
What's fascinating here is the psychology of the open loop. The human brain is a pattern-seeking engine. We demand narrative resolution.
We want an ending.
When a story lacks an ending, when justice is entirely subverted, it creates a psychological itch that we collectively cannot stop scratching. We keep returning to the old files because we desperately want to impose order on a historical chaos.
It really highlights the relentless dedication of modern researchers. They're trying to squeeze new, definitive truths out of incredibly limited ancient records.
It's a daunting task.
They are reading between the lines of 130-year-old police reports, re-evaluating which letters might have been genuine versus which were journalistic hoaxes, and applying modern analytical thinking and geographic profiling to the foggy streets of 1888. But despite all that modern processing power, the ultimate answer remains elusive. The killer successfully vanished into the history books.
And as we look at the totality of this deep dive, we can clearly see the architecture of an immortal legend. It required a very specific crucible.
We really did.
It required the crushing, maze-like environment of Whitechapel to provide the cover. It required the absolute infancy of forensic science, rendering the police practically blind. It required the explosive birth of media sensationalism to give the shadow a viral brand name.
And it required an offender uniquely adapted to exploit every single one of those systemic vulnerabilities.
This history shows us how the severe limitations of an era can permanently alter the trajectory of a criminal investigation, elevating an unknown man into an enduring mythological ghost.
We've explored the incredible duality of a booming metropolis hiding a neglected abyss. We've traced the anatomy of a panic that literally shut down a local economy. We unpacked the viral explosion of the Jack the Ripper letters and the dark reality of public hoaxes.
We felt the sheer frustration of police officers trying to catch a phantom with nothing but rigid patrols and unreliable eyewitnesses in the fog.
Then we explored how the desperate need to understand the killer birthed the earliest forms of behavioral profiling.
It is a profound convergence of geography, society, and the limits of science.
It truly is. And before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over. We know that modern historians are endlessly searching for a new piece of evidence, a newly discovered diary, or some groundbreaking DNA extraction from an old shawl to finally solve this.
They're always looking for that smoking gun.
But think about the sheer volume of that pre-forensic police work. The thousands of interviews, the endless suspect lists. What if the true identity of the killer isn't waiting to be found in some brilliant new deduction? What if he was actually swept up in that massive dragnet in 1888?
It's entirely possible.
Perhaps he was briefly interviewed as a witness on the street, or brought in as a suspect, questioned, and ultimately dismissed simply because he looked a little too much like an ordinary citizen? What if the answer isn't lost in the impenetrable fog of Whitechapel, but has actually been sitting in a dusty box in the police archives all along, misfiled, misunderstood, and hiding in plain sight within the paperwork for over a century?
Now, that is a truly haunting possibility to consider.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It has been an absolute pleasure unpacking this labyrinth of history with you. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.